The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. All eyes were fixed on the judge, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor and sharp tongue. She leaned back in her high-backed leather chair, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose, as she glanced over the case file one more time. The defendant, a young black man named Marcus, stood at the podium, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Defiance, maybe, or perhaps just exhaustion. He'd been here before, and he knew how this usually went. But today was different. Today, something was about to happen. That would leave everyone in that room, especially the judge, utterly stunned. It all started when the judge let out a laugh. Not a polite chuckle or a sympathetic smile, but a full-blown, dismissive laugh that echoed through the courtroom. Marcus had just finished explaining his side of the story, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. He'd been pulled over for a broken taillight, he said, and things had escalated from there. The judge interrupted him mid-sentence, her laughter cutting through his words like a knife. "You expect me to believe that?" she said, shaking her head. "This is the same story I've heard 100 times before. Do you think I was born yesterday?" The gallery murmured, some people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus didn't flinch. He just stood there, his gaze locked on hers, as if he were waiting for something. And then it happened. Without a word, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny object. He held it up for the judge to see, and the room seemed to freeze. It was a badge. Not just any badge, a federal badge. The judge's laughter died in her throat, her eyes widening as she leaned forward, squinting at the emblem in his hand. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice suddenly sharp. Marcus didn't answer right away. He let the moment hang there, the tension thickening with every second. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Your Honor," he said, "I think it's time we had a different kind of conversation." The room erupted in whispers. The prosecutor shot to his feet, objecting, but the judge silenced him with a wave of her hand. She was still staring at Marcus, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Marcus didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just looked at her, his eyes steady, and said, "I think you already know." And with that, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving everyone, judge, jury, and spectators alike, staring after him in stunned silence. But this wasn't the end. In fact, it was only the beginning. Because what Marcus did next would change everything. The judge, still reeling from the shock, called for a recess and retreated to her chambers. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what had just happened. Who was this man? And why had he waited until now to reveal his true identity? The answers, she knew, were out there. But finding them would mean digging into a case that was far more complicated and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined at AS. The courtroom emptied. The tension lingered, thick and unresolved. What had started as a routine hearing had turned into something much bigger, something that would force everyone involved to confront truths they'd rather ignore. And Marcus? He was already gone, disappearing into the city's streets like a ghost. But his presence, and that badge, would haunt the judge long after the gavel had fallen. The question was, what would she do next? And more importantly, what would Marcus do? The stakes were higher than anyone realized, and the next move could change everything. But for now, all anyone could do was wait and wonder. The judge, her robes swishing as she paced the length of her chambers, couldn't shake the image of that badge from her mind. It wasn't just the fact that Marcus had it. It was the way he'd looked at her when he held it up. There was no triumph in his eyes, no smugness, just resolve, like he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. She stopped pacing and sank into her chair, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. Who was he? And why had he chosen her courtroom to make his move? She reached for the case file again, flipping through the pages, but there was nothing unusual there. Just the usual charges: resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, failure to comply. The kind of charges she saw every day. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. If there was something she'd missed. Meanwhile, Marcus was already 3 blocks away, blending into the crowd with the ease of someone who knew how to disappear. He kept his head down, his hands in his pockets, but his mind was racing. He'd played his hand, and now there was no turning back. He knew the judge would start digging, and when she did, she'd find things that would make her question everything she thought she knew about the system she served. But that was the point, wasn't it? He hadn't wanted it to come to this, but sometimes you had to shake the table to get people's attention. And if there was one thing Marcus had learned, it was that people in power rarely listened until you forced them to. Back at the courthouse, the judge was already on the phone. "I need everything you can find on Marcus Johnson," she said to the investigator on the other end of the line. "And I mean everything. Birth records, employment history, any prior arrests. Dig deep." She hung up and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Marcus Johnson. The name was common enough, but something about it felt off. Like it was too ordinary, too plain. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she had a feeling there was more to his story than met the eye. And then there was the badge. A federal badge. What was a federal agent doing in her courtroom, posing as a defendant? It didn't make sense. Unless he wasn't really a defendant at all. As the hours passed, the judge's unease grew. She couldn't stop thinking about the way Marcus had looked at her, like he knew something she didn't, like he was testing her. She'd been a judge for over a decade, and she prided herself on being fair, on seeing through the lies and getting to the truth. But this was different. This felt personal, and that scared her. Because if Marcus was who she thought he might be, then this wasn't just about him. It was about her. And it was about the system she'd dedicated her life to. By the time the investigator called back, the judge was on edge. "What do you have for me?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. The investigator hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Marcus Johnson doesn't exist. At least, not the Marcus Johnson in your courtroom. The name, the social security number, the address, it's all fake. Whoever he is, he's been living under a false identity for years." The judge felt a chill run down her spine. "What about the badge?" she asked. "Was it real?" Another pause. "Yes," the investigator said. "It's real. And it's not just any badge. It's from a division that doesn't officially exist. Black Ops, maybe. Or something even deeper. Whatever this guy is into, it's way above my pay grade." The judge hung up the phone, her mind reeling. Black Ops. A fake identity. This was way beyond anything she'd ever dealt with before. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about Marcus. It was about something bigger. Something that went beyond her courtroom, beyond her city. She thought about the cases she'd presided over, the defendants she'd sentenced, the lives she'd impacted. Had she been fair? Had she been just? Or had she, like so many others, been blind to the flaws in the system? The questions gnawed at her, but there were no easy answers. Not yet. Meanwhile, Marcus was on the move. He'd changed his appearance, a different jacket, a hat pulled low over his face, and he was careful to avoid cameras. He knew they'd be looking for him now, and he couldn't afford to be caught. Not until he'd finished what he'd started. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. "It's done. She knows." The reply came almost instantly. "Good. Now we wait." Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket and kept walking. He didn't know how long it would take for the judge to piece it all together, but he knew she would. She was smart, and she was thorough. And when she did, she'd have a choice to make. A choice that could change everything. As the sun set and the city lights flickered on, the judge sat alone in her chambers, staring at the case file in front of her. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt like a weight, heavy with secrets and unanswered questions. She thought about Marcus, about the badge, about the investigator's words. And she thought about herself, about the choices she'd made, the people she'd judged, the system she'd upheld. For the first time in her career, she felt doubt. Not just about Marcus, but about everything. And that doubt was dangerous. Because once you started questioning the system, there was no going back. But for now, all she could do was wait. Wait for answers. Wait for the next move. And hope that, when the time came, she'd be ready. Because whatever was coming, she knew. One thing for sure, it was going to change everything. And there was no way to stop it. The judge didn't sleep that night. How could she? Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, each one leading to another, and none of them with answers. She sat at her desk, the dim light of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The case file was still open in front of her, but it felt useless now. Marcus Johnson, or whoever he really was, had left her with more questions than answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And she had a sinking feeling that she was about to uncover it, whether she was ready or not. The next morning, the judge arrived at the courthouse early, her steps brisk and purposeful. She had a plan. If Marcus was connected to some kind of black ops division, then there had to be a paper trail somewhere. And if there was one thing she was good at, it was following a trail. She started with the courthouse records, pulling every case Marcus had been involved in over the past few years. At first glance, they seemed unrelated: traffic violations, minor altercations, nothing out of the ordinary. But as she dug deeper, she noticed a pattern. Every time Marcus had appeared in court, something strange had happened. A key witness would go missing. Evidence would disappear. Cases would be dismissed. On technicalities, it was almost as if someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, making sure Marcus never stayed in one place for too long. Meanwhile, Marcus was lying low, but he wasn't idle. He had his own trail to follow, and it led straight to the heart of the city's power structure. He knew the judge would start digging, and he needed to stay one step ahead. He reached out to an old contact, a journalist who had been investigating corruption in the city for years. "I need your help," Marcus said when they met in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. "I've got something big, but I can't do it alone." The journalist, a woman named Elena, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "What kind of big?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, then pulled out a small USB drive and slid it across the table. "The kind that gets people killed," he said. "But if we do this right, it could change everything." Elena took the drive, her fingers brushing against it like it might burn her. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't need to. She could see it in Marcus's eyes. This was the story she'd been waiting for. But she also knew it came with a price. "You know they'll come after us, right?" she said quietly. Marcus nodded. "I know," he said. "But if we don't do this, who will?" Elena slipped the drive into her bag and stood up. "I'll be in touch," she said, and then she was gone, disappearing into the night like a shadow. Back at the courthouse, the judge was making progress, but it wasn't the kind of progress she wanted. Every lead she followed seemed to hit a dead end. Witnesses who had disappeared, records that had been erased. It was like trying to catch smoke with her bare hands. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She called in a favor from an old friend, a retired detective named Frank who had a reputation for getting answers when no one else could. "I need you to look into something for me," she said when he arrived at her office. "It's sensitive." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Sensitive how?" he asked. The judge hesitated, then handed him a folder. "Just look into it," she said. "And be careful. I don't know who we're dealing with, but they're good. Too good." Frank took the folder and flipped through it, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is some heavy stuff," he said finally. "You sure you want to open this can of worms?" The judge nodded. "I don't have a choice," she said. "If I don't, who will?" Frank studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll see what I can find. But if this goes south, you're on your own." The judge smiled faintly. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As the days passed, the tension grew. The judge felt like she was walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from falling into the abyss. She started noticing things: strange cars parked outside her house, phone calls that ended in static, emails that never arrived. It was subtle, but it was there. Someone was watching her. And she had a feeling they weren't just watching. They were waiting. Marcus, meanwhile, was deep in his own investigation. The USB drive he'd given Elena contained files that implicated some of the city's most powerful people in a web of corruption that went all the way to the top. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. He needed more. And to get more, he needed to take risks. He reached out to another contact, a former cop who had been forced off the force after blowing the whistle on misconduct. "I need access to the evidence locker," Marcus said when they met in a deserted parking garage. "Can you get me in?" The former cop, a man named Ray, shook his head. "You're playing with fire, man," he said. "You know that, right?" Marcus nodded. "I know," he said. "But if we don't do this, the fire's going to burn us all." Ray hesitated, then sighed. "All right," he said. "I'll get you in. But if this goes sideways, I never met you." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "Deal," he said. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The judge was getting closer, and so were the people who wanted to stop him. He needed to move fast. But fast was dangerous, and dangerous could get him killed. The judge, meanwhile, was closing in on her own answers. Frank had come through, uncovering a connection between Marcus and a shadowy organization that operated outside the law. They call themselves the Circle, Frank said when he met with the judge in a secluded park. They're not just corrupt, they're untouchable. Cops, judges, politicians, they've got people everywhere. And if Marcus is mixed up with them, you're in way over your head. The judge felt a chill run down her spine. What do you suggest I do? She asked. Frank shook his head. I don't know, he said. But whatever it is, you'd better do it fast. Because if they find out you're looking into them, you're as good as dead. The judge nodded, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She knew what she had to do. But as she walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. Still, the feeling lingered. Someone was out there, and they were closer than she thought. The tension was building, the stakes higher than ever. The judge, Marcus, Elena, Frank, they were all pieces of a puzzle, each one moving closer to the truth. But the truth was dangerous, and the closer they got, the more they risked losing everything. The question was, who would make the next move? And what would it cost them? For now, all they could do was wait, and hope that, when the time came, they'd be ready. Because the storm was coming, and no one would be safe. The judge's hands trembled as she locked her office door behind her. The weight of what she'd uncovered pressed down on her like a physical force. The Circle. The name alone sent a shiver down her spine. Frank's warning echoed in her mind. Asterisk. If they find out you're looking into them, you're as good as dead. Asterisk. She glanced at the clock. It was late. The courthouse empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old building settling. She couldn't stay here. Not tonight. Not when she knew they were watching. She grabbed her coat and slipped out through a side exit, her eyes scanning the shadows as she hurried to her car. The streets were quiet, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive. Every sound, a distant car engine, the rustle of leaves, made her jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her. As she drove home, she kept checking her rearview mirror, her heart pounding every time headlights appeared behind her. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she was drenched in sweat. She locked the doors behind her and leaned against them, trying to catch her breath. But the fear didn't leave. It clung to her, a constant reminder that she was no longer safe. Meanwhile, Marcus was in the evidence locker, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he sifted through boxes of files. Ray had gotten him in, but the clock was ticking. He didn't have much time. His fingers moved quickly, flipping through documents, scanning for anything that could tie the Circle to the corruption he knew ran deep. And then he found it, a file marked with a single black circle. His breath caught as he opened it. Inside were names, dates, transactions. Proof. But it wasn't just proof of corruption. It was proof of something far darker. Something that made his blood run cold. He snapped a photo of the file with his phone and slipped it back into the box. He had what he needed. Now he just had to get out. But as he turned to leave, he heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. Marcus froze, his mind racing. There was no way out except the door he'd come through. He glanced around, looking for a place to hide. But the room was filled with shelves and boxes, nowhere to go. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He crouched behind a stack of boxes, holding his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. The door creaked open, and a beam of light swept across the room. Marcus clenched his fists, ready to fight if he had to. But then the light stopped, and a voice broke the silence. I know you're in here, it said. And I know what you're looking for. Marcus didn't move. He didn't dare. The voice was calm, almost amused, but there was an edge to it, a threat. You think you're clever, the voice continued. But you're in over your head. You don't know what you're dealing with. Marcus stayed silent, his muscles coiled like a spring. The footsteps started again, moving closer. He could see the shadow now, tall and imposing, blocking the door. There was no way out. No way except through. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. And then he lunged. The fight was quick and brutal. Marcus moved with precision, every strike calculated, every movement deliberate. But the other man was strong, and he fought dirty. They crashed into shelves, sending boxes tumbling to the floor. Marcus felt a blow to his ribs, the pain sharp and immediate, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted, forcing him to the ground. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beams spinning wildly. In the chaos, Marcus saw his chance. He kicked the man in the stomach, sending him sprawling, and bolted for the door. He didn't look back. He didn't stop. He just by the time he made it to his car. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely grip the steering wheel. He started the engine and pulled away, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. No one was following him. Not yet. But he knew it was only a matter of time. He pulled out his phone and dialed Elena's number. She answered on the first ring. "I've got it," he said, his voice low and urgent. "But they know. They're coming." There was a pause, and then Elena said, "Meet me at the safe house. And Marcus, be careful." The judge, meanwhile, was sitting at her kitchen table, a glass of wine in front of her. She hadn't touched it. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, replaying everything she'd learned, everything she'd seen. The circle wasn't just a group of corrupt officials. It was a network, a system designed to protect itself at all costs. And she had stumbled right into the middle of it. She thought about Marcus, about the badge he'd flashed in her courtroom. Was he part of it? Or was he trying to bring it down? She didn't know. But she knew one thing. She couldn't do this alone. She picked up her phone and dialed Frank's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "It's me," she said. "I need your help. I think I'm in danger." There was a pause, and then Frank said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone." She hung up and sat back, her eyes fixed on the window. The street outside was quiet, but the silence felt like a trap. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something bad. And then she heard it, a faint creak, like someone stepping on the porch. Her breath caught, and she stood up slowly, her heart pounding. The creak came again, closer this time. She reached for the phone, her fingers trembling, as she dialed 911. But before she could hit call, the front door burst open. She froze, her eyes wide with terror, as a figure stepped into the room. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at her. And then he took a step forward. The judge backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of fear. The man took another step, and then another, until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out, his hand closing around her wrist, and leaned in close. "You shouldn't have looked into things that don't concern you," he said, his voice low and menacing. And then everything went black. The tension was at its peak, the stakes higher than ever. Marcus was on the run, the judge was in danger, and the circle was closing in. The storm was here, and no one was safe. The question was, who would make it out alive? And what would be left when the dust settled? For now, all they could do was hold on and hope, because the worst was yet to come. The judge woke up to the sound of muffled voices. Her head throbbed, and her vision blurred as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. She was no longer in her home. The room was dimly lit, the walls bare and cold. Her hands were bound behind her back, the rough texture of the rope digging into her skin. Panic surged through her as she struggled to remember what had happened. The man at her door, the way he'd grabbed her, and then nothing. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, and that's when she saw him. Marcus. He was sitting across the room, his hands tied just like hers, his face bruised and bloodied. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want it to come to this." The judge stared at him, her mind racing. What was he doing here? Was he part of this? Or was he a prisoner, just like her? Before she could ask, the door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, his face obscured by a hood, but his presence was commanding. He walked over to Marcus and crouched down, his voice low and cold. "You've caused a lot of trouble," he said, "but it ends here." Marcus didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. The man stood up and turned to the judge. "And you," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You should have stayed out of things you didn't understand. But now you're part of this, whether you like it or not." The judge's heart pounded as the man walked out, slamming the door behind him. She turned to Marcus, her voice trembling. "What is this? Who are these people?" Marcus hesitated, then sighed. They're the circle, he said. And they're not just corrupt. They're dangerous. More dangerous than you can imagine. The judge felt a chill run down her spine. And you? She asked. Are you one of them? Marcus shook his head. I was, he admitted. But I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be part of what they were doing. So I left. And now they want to make sure I don't talk. The judge's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. If Marcus had been part of the circle, then he knew things that could bring them down. But if they were willing to go this far to silence him, then what did that mean for her? She was just a judge. She hadn't even known about the circle until a few days ago. And now she was trapped in a room with a man who had once been one of them, her life hanging in the balance. What do they want? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. They want to make an example, he said, of both of us. Meanwhile, Elena was pacing the floor of the safe house, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Marcus was supposed to be here by now. He should have been here hours ago. She tried calling him again, but it went straight to voicemail. Her stomach churned with worry. Something was wrong. She knew it. She glanced at the USB drive on the table, the one Marcus had given her. It was their only hope, the only proof they had of the circle's crimes. But without Marcus, it was useless. She couldn't do this alone. She needed him. And if he didn't show up soon, she didn't know what she would do. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Elena froze, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She crept to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Frank. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and opened the door. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice tense. Frank stepped inside, his expression grim. I came to warn you, he said. They're coming. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want. Elena's eyes widened. What do you mean? She asked. Frank hesitated, then said, the circle knows about the files. And they know you have them. You're not safe here. None of us are. Elena felt a wave of panic wash over her. If the circle was coming for her, then Marcus was in even more danger than she'd thought. She grabbed the USB drive and shoved it into her pocket. We need to go, she said. Now. Frank nodded, but before they could move, there was a loud crash from outside. Elena's blood ran cold as she heard voices, angry, shouting voices. They were here. Frank grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door. This way, he said. Hurry. They slipped out into the night, the sound of footsteps close behind them. Elena's heart pounded as they ran, her mind racing. They couldn't outrun the circle forever, but they had to try, because if they didn't, it was over. For all of them. Back in the dimly lit room, the judge and Marcus sat in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. The judge turned to Marcus, her voice barely a whisper. Is there any way out of this? She asked. Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. There's always a way, he said. But it's not going to be easy. And it's going to cost us. The judge nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going down without a fight. And neither was Marcus. The stakes had never been higher. The circle was closing in, and time was running out. The judge, Marcus, Elena, and Frank were all caught in a web of danger and deceit, each one fighting for their lives. But the question remained, who would make it out alive? And what would be left when the dust settled? For now, all they could do was hold on and hope, because the worst was yet to come. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same.